Yeah, thanks, Ben. Thanks for having me in this really interesting format for a conference. I really like that. So even it's not my habit to talk just for 10 minutes. Normally I talk for ages without breathing. So I have to really rush up a little bit. So I'm Oliver, or Olivier, as some Microsoft folks call me. I'm living in the near of Frankfurt, and I'm leading the German data platform community together with the friends, like, for example, Kostya, you already heard some minutes ago, or Frank this morning, Mr. Captain on his Docker. So what I want to do today is just talk a little bit about Delta, not data lake, because what I recognize when I work with clients is that a lot of people just mix these kind of things completely together, and they say maybe, yeah, I have a Delta lake and so on. And this kind of topic, I just want to give you 10 minutes about what is this kind of Delta lake all about, and why do we have these kind of Delta lake as an innovation, and what is it good for? So try to have this going. And so the data lake itself, of course, a lot of you know this, it's a really cheap and durable data storage. So it's rather cool to, yeah, you can just pump in any kind of data that you like, as much data as you like. You do not have to think about in terms of, like, when you're comparing this to a data warehouse or something like this, about the storage cost at all. You can just take your data and leave it there, and maybe you still don't need it at the moment, but you maybe do this later on. You can store any kind of formats, like structured, semi-structured, or unstructured data. It's very open source driven, so a lot of innovation comes from the community, comes from open source standards, and one of the file standards there is Parquet. We already had a nice talk this morning where we heard about how to use Parquet in Power BI. But in the end, what it is just a cheap storage as the first thing. So if you are coming from a let's say maybe a database background, a SQL Server background, and so on, and you think about what you want to use a file service thing for doing database analytics, etc., etc. Sometimes this comes a little bit of a shock, and you say, hey, how do I do certain things? And yes, there are elements in there that are not so awesome, like what we heard here with a data lake. There are things like, for example, if you want to change data. So for example, if you have a GDPR task where you need to delete certain records out of your data lake in some kind of sources in your data lake, this is getting quite difficult to do. As well, things like achieving consistency. As you can pump in everything you like, there is no kind of validation, there is no kind of enforcement of any kind of data structure itself. So you have to build this all by yourself, and that's somehow a little bit of work that you have to do. And then you have also some stuff like, for example, if you want to do streaming and you want to stream the data into the lake, of course this works, and there are a lot of things that already are in place, but it still is something that is rather complex, and it's still something that maybe you have to think about the concepts, you have to read a lot how to do this, etc. Yeah. Another thing that is not so good in the data lake, even you can afford a lot of history because you can store as many files as long as you like. It's quite tricky to get the history of it. Yeah. So for example, if you want to jump back in time and you want to see exactly how was it, let's say in the last month, the data set, that's quite tricky to achieve. Yeah. And one of the things that is quite relevant for me, because I'm doing a lot in the data quality section, also data quality is really hard to achieve, to see exactly, okay, if I push data into it, is there any kind of process I can trigger immediately that check the data quality of the ingested data, etc. This is all stuff that is a little bit tricky. And there, over the time, the guys from Databricks, they invented something that they call the Delta Lake. yeah, the Delta Lake. Why did they choose this kind of name? I don't know exactly, but I think the lake part was just a good marketing thing. But of course, it confuses a lot of people. So first thing, Delta Lake is not a storage. Delta Lake is a file structure. It's a logic. It's a way how to place data in a data lake. Yeah, so Delta Lake needs a data lake, and you can do this kind of special formats and so on different things. Like, for example, on Amazon, you can do that on IBM, on Google, and on Oracle. And of course, you can do this in an Azure data lake as well. So what it is all about, the Delta Lake, just in this kind of 10 minutes, is a kind of Parquet file. So we heard about Parquet this morning. It's a very common file for the data lake because it's cool. It's a column store format. It's compressed. It has metadata already in it. And what they did at Databricks, they aligned to this some kind of JSON files, which are describing the metadata as in the Parquet file, but also running a kind of log. So if you're coming from the SQL Server and you know you have a transaction log anyhow, and this is something you do not have on the data lake, as I mentioned before. So with these JSON files, you write a log into the lake as well in relationship to the data that you are placing in. And this gives you a lot of opportunities and a lot of possibilities. This kind of Delta Lake is open source. You will see the link to the website as well. It's based on, it's shared with the Linux Foundation, so you can just use it. So what kind of things enables this kind of data lake? On the one side, it enables things like this kind of asset structure. That means you have the possibility of having really the transaction log. You know exactly when you placed some stuff in it. If it isn't correctly placed into the lake, it will fail. So you have this kind of guarantee that it is correct. You have a consistency. You have also the isolation. If a lot of people push data immediately into it, that the data is as well isolated from the concurrent execution. And of course, you have the durability of it. So with this kind of transaction log or with this kind of JSON files, you have the possibility to get this kind of functionality through the Delta Lake format. On the other side, you have the possibility to stream data. So it's quite easy to call this, for example, in Python, you say spark.read stream, and then you can stream this data on the one side as a source, but as well as a sink. And that's one of the things that I like is you can also enforce things like data quality. Like, for example, you can define constraints to the data. So, for example, if you load stuff into it, you can have checks that can see if a number is in a certain range or if this is a certain date field, etc. So all of this is also part of the Delta Lake functionality. In addition to this, I also have a cool functionality that is something when schema is changing. First of all, you can enforce a certain kind of schema. So you can say a certain table or something like this has a certain numbers of attributes. But you can also say, hey, if I load new data to it, if there is a new attribute in there, I can just append this in terms of my columns, and I do not crash any kind of loading structure or something like this. I can also do this in terms of that I can really change it or I can restrict it. So I'm very easy to do this, and I have, with the possibility of a merge statement, I have to have the functionality to do this quite easily with a lot of just some lines of code, as you see here. In the end, you also have some kind of time travel functionality. So you can say, hey, I can go back because I have the log in the background and I can see, okay, give me the data just from a certain kind of timestamp. And I can also see the history, how the data is changing. So that's also awesome, I think. At last, you will have the functionality is now supported by Databricks, of course, because they were the people who developed it, but also it's now available in a public preview in Synapse. You have that in the Azure Data Factory, and our good old friend Gerhard has created on GitHub a function for Power BI, so you can use that in Power BI as well. With this, I think have a look to Delta Lake if you're working with data lakes as such. Really cool stuff. With this, thank you very much for your audience, and yeah, have a nice further afternoon with the Data Minutes.